Document. Part 1. Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door of the bar and stepped inside. The faint smell of spilled beer and polished wood greeted him as he scanned the dimly lit room. It was a quiet evening, just how he liked it. The bar wasn't. Crowded, just a few regulars scattered around, nursing their drinks in silence. A jazz tune played softly in the background, its melancholy notes blending perfectly with the mood of the place. He walked over to his usual spot at the far end of the counter, where he could sit unnoticed. Ethan wasn't much of a talker. Came here not for conversation, but for solitude. After a long day at work, this was his escape, a place to unwind, without having to think about deadlines or responsibilities. He ordered a whiskey on the rocks and leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the day slip away. That's when he noticed her. She was sitting alone at a small table near the corner. Half hidden by shadows, her presence seemed out of place. In the otherwise ordinary setting, she wore a simple black jacket over a plain white shirt, but there was something about her that caught Ethan's attention. Maybe it was the way she held herself with quiet confidence, or maybe it was her eyes. Even from across the room, he could see they were sharp, almost unnervingly so. They glimmered faintly under the low light, like two shards of ice reflecting. The glow of the nearby lamp? For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He didn't usually approach strangers, especially women. But tonight, curiosity got the better of him. Setting down his drink, he stood up and made his way toward her table. His footsteps echoed lightly against the hardwood floor, but she didn't look up until he was standing right beside her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the nervousness bubbling beneath the surface. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those piercing blue eyes. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. "Sure," she said simply, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Ethan sat down, suddenly aware of how awkward he must seem. "I'm Ethan," he offered, hoping to break. "The ice, Claire," she replied, her tone neutral. There was no warmth in her greeting, but neither was there hostility. Just indifference. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Ethan glanced around the room, searching for something to say. The bartender was wiping glasses, and a couple at another table laughed quietly over their cocktails. Finally, he turned back to Claire and blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "So, do you come here often?" To his surprise, she chuckled softly. It wasn't a loud laugh, more like a quiet exhale of amusement. "Not really," she admitted. "Just passing through." Her answer left him wanting to know more. Passing through? What did that even mean? Was she traveling? Running from something? Or perhaps running toward it? Ethan couldn't tell. But he found himself intrigued all the same. "You don't strike me as the type who frequents bars," he ventured cautiously. "No offense." Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his comment. "And what type is that?" Ethan shrugged, feeling a bit bolder now. "I don't know. Someone who seems, to put together, I guess. Like you've got better things to do than sit in a dive like this." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe I do have better things to do. Or maybe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Her words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, though he couldn't quite explain why. There was something unsettling about the way she spoke, as if every sentence carried hidden meaning. Still, he pressed on, driven by a mix of fascination and unease. "What brings you to Chicago?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Claire took a sip of her drink before answering. "Business?" she said vaguely. "And you? Just living here?" Ethan replied. "Born and raised? Never really had a reason to leave?" She nodded, thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars against the dark sky. For a while, neither of them spoke. Ethan wondered if he should excuse himself and return to his original seat. Something about Claire made him feel off balance, like he was treading water in deep, uncharted territory. But then she spoke again, pulling him back into the moment. "You ever wonder what people are capable of?" she asked abruptly, her voice low and deliberate. "The lengths they'll go to when pushed into a corner?" Ethan blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in conversation. I guess so." "Why?" Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him with those icy blue eyes, as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "People think they know the world," she began. "They think they understand how things work. But there's always more beneath the surface. Things most people can't even imagine." Ethan frowned, unsure of where this was going. "Are you talking about crime, corruption, that kind of stuff?" Claire smirked, but it wasn't a happy expression. "Crime and corruption are just the tip of the iceberg," she said cryptically. "The real monsters aren't the ones who steal or cheat. They're the ones who play God." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Was she speaking metaphorically, or was she hinting at something more sinister? Before he could respond, she changed the subject entirely. "Dell." "Me, Ethan," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Have you ever killed anyone?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He froze, his mind racing. Where had that come from? Was she serious? He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. All he could do was stare at her, dumbfounded. Claire watched him closely, her expression unreadable. And then slowly she smiled. It wasn't a warm or friendly smile. It was cold and calculating, sending a chill through the room. The other patrons seemed to notice too. Conversations faltered, laughter died down, and the soft hum of the jazz music suddenly felt deafening. A brief moment, the entire bar fell silent as if everyone sensed the tension radiating from their corner. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why would you ask me that?" he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire's smile widened, revealing a hint of teeth. "Because sometimes," she murmured, "the truth is written all over someone's face." Words lingered in the air, leaving Ethan unsettled. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Or maybe it was the realization that he might not want to know the truth after all. Whatever it was, one thing was certain. Claire was unlike anyone he'd ever met. And as much as he wanted to walk away, he knew he wouldn't. Not yet. 'Cause deep down, he suspected that their encounter was only the beginning of something far bigger, and far more dangerous than he could possibly comprehend. Document. Part 2. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a headache. It wasn't just from the whiskey he'd had at the bar. It was the kind of ache that came from too much thinking. Too many unanswered questions swirling around in his mind. Claire's words echoed in his head like a broken record. Asterisk, "Have you ever killed anyone?" He replayed their conversation over and over, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. Who was she? What did she mean by playing God? And why had her smile made the entire room go silent? He sat up in bed, rubbing his temples. The sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh, almost mocking. His apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic outside. Normally, this was the time he'd grab a cup of coffee and start getting ready for work. But today, he couldn't focus. All he could think about was Claire. Ethan glanced at his phone, half expecting to see a missed call or text from her. Of course, there was nothing. She hadn't given him her number, and he didn't even know her last name. For all he knew, she could have been lying about everything: her name, her story, even her reason for being in Chicago. But something deep inside told him she wasn't. There was an authenticity to her, a rawness that couldn't be faked. Whatever secrets she carried, they were real. By my afternoon, Ethan decided he needed answers. He couldn't let the mystery of Claire consume him any longer. She wanted to play games. Fine, but he wasn't going to sit on the sidelines. While she dangled cryptic clues in front of him, grabbing his jacket, he headed out into the crisp autumn air. He didn't have a plan exactly, but he figured the bar was as good a place to start as any. Maybe someone there had seen her before. Maybe they knew more than they let on. When Ethan arrived at the bar, it looked different in the daylight. The cozy, shadowy atmosphere of the previous night had been replaced by something brighter, more ordinary. A few customers sat at the counter, chatting casually with the bartender. Ethan took a seat near the end and ordered a soda. As he waited, he scanned the room, searching for anything unusual. Nothing stood out, just the usual collection of stools, tables, and dim lighting fixtures hanging from the ceiling. The bartender approached with his drink. A middle-aged man with graying hair and a friendly smile. "Back again?" said, recognizing Ethan from the night before. "Didn't think we'd see you so soon?" Ethan forced a chuckle. "Yeah, well, I met someone here last night, a woman. She was sitting over there." He pointed toward the corner where Claire had been. "Do you remember her?" The bartender frowned, scratching his chin. Don't recall seeing anyone special last night. Just the regulars, mostly." Ethan's heart sank. "Are you sure?" Eyes wore a black jacket. "Nope," the bartender interrupted, shaking his head. "Sorry, buddy. Doesn't ring a bell." For a moment, Ethan wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. Had Claire really been there? Or was she some figment of his imagination? That was ridiculous. He'd spoken to her, heard her voice, seen her face. She was real. So why didn't anyone else seem to notice her? Determined not to give up, Ethan left the bar and started walking aimlessly through the streets. He wandered past shops and cafes, his mind racing. If Claire wasn't staying in the area, where would she go? What kind of person moved through life leaving no trace behind? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that she wasn't your average traveler. Something about her screamed danger and intrigue. As evening fell, Ethan found himself back at his apartment, staring blankly at the TV without actually watching it. He was about to call it a day when there was a soft knock at his door. At first, he thought he must have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, cautiously. Ethan got up and peeked through the peephole. Standing on the other side was Claire. She looked exactly as she had the night before, calm, composed, and utterly unreadable. Without hesitation, Ethan unlocked the door and opened it. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tinged. With both surprise and suspicion, Claire stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," she said simply, closing the door behind her. Ethan crossed his arms, trying to appear unimpressed despite the fact that his pulse was racing. "About what?" She turned to face him, her expression serious. "About what?" "I said last night, about the things people are capable of." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're going to explain yourself now? After all the cryptic nonsense you fed me yesterday?" Claire ignored his sarcasm. "You wanted answers?" She said, "Fine, here's one. I wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, I was just like you, an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, went to school, worked a 9-to-5 job. Nothing exciting, nothing out of the ordinary." Ethan listened intently, unsure whether to believe her or not. "And then what happened?" prompted. Her gaze hardened. "Then I found out the truth," she said. "About the world, about the people pulling the strings behind the scenes, about the experiments there, conducting things that most people wouldn't dare to dream of, let alone attempt." "What kind of experiments?" Ethan asked, his curiosity outweighing his skepticism. Claire hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke. "Imagine a technology so advanced that it can rewrite human consciousness. Not just memories, but personality traits, emotions, instincts. Everything that makes you who you are, they can erase it and replace it with something else. Something artificial." Ethan's stomach churned. "That sounds like science fiction." "It's not," Claire shot back sharply. "It's happening right now, under everyone's noses. Governments, corporations, rogue scientists there. All involved, they call it Project Nemesis." The name sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. "Because I need your help," she admitted. "I'm part of a group trying to stop them. Been working undercover for years, gathering evidence, sabotaging their operations. But we're running out of time. They're close to completing the project. And once they do..." She trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. Ethan shook his head, struggling to process what she was saying. "Even if I believed. Which, I'm not saying I do. Why would you come to me? I'm nobody. I don't have any skills that would be useful to you." "You're wrong," Claire countered. "You're an engineer, aren't you? You specialize in software systems. But that's exactly what we need. Someone who understands how these technologies work, who can find weaknesses and exploit them. Stared at her, torn between disbelief and fascination. On one hand, her story sounded outrageous, like something out of a conspiracy thriller. On the other hand, there was something about the way she spoke that made him want to believe her. Her conviction was undeniable. "I don't know," he muttered, pacing across the room. "This is insane. You're asking me to risk my life based on a wild theory." "It's not a theory," Claire insisted. "It's reality. And if you walk away now, you'll regret it, because sooner or later, this will affect everyone, including you." Her words hung heavy in the air. Ethan stopped pacing and looked at her. Despite her calm demeanor, he could see the urgency in her eyes. She wasn't lying, that much was clear. Whether she was telling the truth about everything else remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. She believed every word she was saying. "Okay," he said finally, exhaling deeply. "Let's say I agree to help you. Where do we start?" A flicker of relief passed over Claire's face, though she quickly masked it. "There's a facility on the outskirts of the city," she explained. "They're using it to test prototypes of the technology. If we can get inside, we might be able to gather enough evidence to expose them, and if we get caught?" Ethan asked, already dreading the answer. "We won't," Claire said firmly. "Not if we're careful." Ethan nodded slowly, still unsure if he was making the right decision. But deep down, he knew he couldn't turn away. Whatever Claire was involved in, it was bigger than either of them, and maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. As they began planning their next move, Ethan realized that his life was about to change forever. From this point forward, there would be no turning back. Document Part 3. It was late at night when Ethan and Claire finally left his apartment. The streets were quiet, the city's usual buzz, replaced by a soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. Ethan felt a strange mix of excitement and dread as they walked side by side. He had agreed to help Claire, but he still wasn't sure what he was getting himself into. All he knew was that the next few hours or days could change everything. Claire led him to an old beat-up car parked in a dark alley. It looked like it had seen better days, with scratches on its paint job and a dent in the passenger door. But she didn't seem bothered by its condition. She unlocked it quickly and slid into the driver's seat, motioning for Ethan to get in. "Where are we going?" he asked as he buckled his seatbelt. "To the facility," Claire replied, starting the engine. "We need to scout it out first, get a sense of the layout, the security measures. You'll see soon enough." Ethan nodded, though. His stomach churned with nerves. He glanced out the window as they drove, watching the city fade into the background. The farther they went, the more desolate the surroundings became. Abandoned warehouses lined the road, their windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. Street lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the pavement. It felt like they were entering another world, one far removed from the bustling life of downtown Chicago. After about 20 minutes, Claire pulled off the main road onto a dirt path that wound through dense woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though he knew it was probably just his imagination playing tricks on him. Finally, they reached a clearing where a massive building stood. It was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and floodlights illuminated the perimeter. Security cameras were mounted at regular intervals, their lenses glinting ominously in the darkness. A gate blocked the entrance, guarded by 2 men in black uniforms armed with rifles. "This is it," Claire whispered, turning off the headlights and parking behind a cluster of bushes. "Keep your voice down." Ethan stared at the facility, his heart pounding. "This place looks intense," he murmured. "How are we supposed to get inside?" Claire smirked, pulling a small backpack from the floor of the car. "That's where preparation comes in handy." She opened the bag and revealed an array of gadgets, a pair of binoculars, a tablet-like device, and several other tools Ethan didn't recognize. "First, we gather intel. Then, we plan our move," she handed him the binoculars. "Take a look. See if you notice anything unusual." Ethan hesitated, but did as she instructed. Through the lenses, he could make out details he hadn't noticed before. The guards patrolled in pairs, moving along predictable routes. There was a keypad next to the gate, presumably used to enter a code. Beyond the fence, he spotted a loading dock with several large crates stacked nearby. But what caught his attention most was a vent on the side of the building, a potential entry point. "I think I see something," he said softly, lowering the binoculars. "There's a vent near the back. If we can disable the cameras, maybe we can sneak in that way." Claire nodded approvingly. "Good eye. Now let's figure out how to deal with the cameras." She retrieved the tablet from her bag and turned it on. The screen lit up, displaying a map of the area overlaid with blinking dots, representing the security cameras. "This gadget will help us identify blind spots," she explained. "Once we find one, we can use this." She held up a small device, resembling a remote control, to temporarily jam the signal. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You carry all this stuff around with you? You never know when it might come in handy." She replied with a shrug. They spent the next hour studying the facility, marking patrol patterns and identifying weaknesses in the security system. Claire worked methodically, her movements precise and confident. Ethan admired her focus, even as his own mind raced with doubts. What if they got caught? What if someone recognized them? These questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside. He had made a choice to help Claire, and now he needed to follow through. When they were satisfied with their observations, Claire suggested they retreat for the night. "We've got enough info to work with," she said. "Tomorrow, we'll put together a solid plan." Relieved, Ethan agreed. They drove back to the city in silence, each lost in their thoughts. When they arrived at his apartment, Claire turned to him before getting out of the car. "Thanks for coming tonight," she said. "I know it wasn't easy." Ethan gave a half smile. "Yeah, well, I guess I'm committed now. Might as well see it through." Claire nodded, then added, "Just remember, one wrong move, and we're both done for. Stick to the plan no matter what." With that, she disappeared into the night, leaving Ethan alone with his racing thoughts. He went inside and collapsed onto the couch, replaying the events of the evening in his head. Despite his fears, he couldn't deny the thrill of it all. For the first time in years, he felt alive, like he was part of something bigger than himself. Next day, Ethan met Claire at a diner on the outskirts of the city. She had already spread out maps and notes on the table, sketching out a rough blueprint of the facility. Over coffee, they discussed their strategy in detail. "We'll go in at midnight," Claire said, pointing to the map. "It's when the patrols are least active. We'll approach from the east, using the blind spot near the rear fence. From there, we can access the vent and crawl into the building." "And once we're inside?" Ethan asked. "We split up," Claire replied. "You head to the server room, it's marked here, and download any data you can find. I'll handle distractions to keep the guards busy." Ethan frowned. "Splitting up sounds risky. What if something goes wrong?" "It's necessary," Claire insisted. "We don't have time to waste. Besides, I trust you to get the job done." Her confidence in him was both reassuring and terrifying. He wanted to believe he could pull it off, but the thought of navigating a high-security facility alone made his palms sweat. "What about backup?" he asked. "What happens if we're caught?" Claire hesitated, her expression darkening. "Don't have backup. If we're caught, we're on our own, which is why we need to be careful." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Got it." By the time they finished planning, the sun was setting. Claire packed up her materials and stood up. "Get some rest," she told him. "Tomorrow night, everything changes." As Ethan watched her leave, he felt a surge of determination. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready, or at least he hoped he was. That evening, Ethan prepared for the mission. He packed a flashlight, a multi-tool, and a spare phone preloaded with encryption software. Claire had given him strict instructions not to bring anything unnecessary, so he left his wallet and keys behind. As he waited for her to arrive, he paced his apartment, rehearsing their plan in his mind. When Claire finally showed up, she was dressed in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by a hood. Wordlessly, they climbed into her car and headed back toward the facility. The drive felt shorter this time, perhaps because Ethan's nerves were too frayed to notice the passing scenery. Upon arriving, they slipped quietly into the woods, sticking close to the shadows. The air was cold and damp, and every sound, crunch of leaves underfoot, the hoot of an owl in the distance, seemed amplified. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as they approached the fence. Claire crouched low, pulling out the jamming device. "Ready?" she whispered. Ethan nodded, gripping his flashlight tightly. "Let's do this." With the press of a button, the nearest camera went dark. Claire moved swiftly, cutting a hole in the fence just large enough for them to crawl through. Once inside, they hugged the wall, staying out of sight as they made their way to the vent. "This is it," Claire murmured, gesturing to the metal grate. "You go first." Taking a deep breath, Ethan pried the grate open and hoisted himself inside. The space was tight, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, but he pressed on, guided by the faint glow of his flashlight. Behind him, Claire followed silently, her presence a constant reminder of the stakes. Together, they navigated the narrow ductwork until they reached the drop-off point. Peering down, Ethan saw the server room below, a maze of blinking lights and humming machines. "One step closer," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, steeling himself for what came next. This was only the beginning, but already he could feel the weight of the secrets they were about to uncover. Document. Part 4. The server room was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of machines and the blinking lights that cast a faint glow across the walls. Ethan dropped down from the vent, landing lightly on the cold tile floor. Claire followed, close behind, her movements as silent as a shadow. For a moment, they stood still, listening intently for any signs of trouble. The air smelled faintly of metal and electricity. The temperature was cooler than Ethan had expected. "All right," Claire whispered, pulling out a small device from her pocket. "This jammer will keep the cameras in here blind for 10 minutes. "That's all we've got." Ethan nodded, his throat dry. He glanced around the room, taking in the rows of servers stacked neatly against the walls. Each one was labeled with numbers and codes he didn't understand. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting everything together like a giant web. It felt overwhelming, but he reminded himself why they were here, to find evidence of Project Nemesis. "You know what to do?" Claire asked, her voice low but firm. "I think so," Ethan replied, though his hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the encrypted phone she'd given him earlier. "I'll connect this to the main terminal and download whatever I can." "You said it would copy files automatically, right?" "Right," Claire confirmed. "Just make sure you don't touch anything else. If you accidentally trigger an alarm, we're done for." Ethan swallowed hard and stepped toward the nearest server. His fingers hovered over the keyboard attached to it, hesitating for a split second before typing in the commands Claire had taught him. The screen flickered to life, displaying lines of code that meant nothing to him. But the phone in his hand began to vibrate softly, signaling that the data transfer had started. While Ethan worked, Claire moved to the door, pressing her ear against it to listen for footsteps or voices. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. So far, so good. No guards had come rushing in yet. Still, she knew better than to let her guard down. Facilities like this always had backup systems in place, hidden sensors, silent alarms, things even the most careful intruders might miss. "How's it going?" she asked softly, glancing back at Ethan. "It's working," he muttered, keeping his eyes glued to the screen. "But it's slow. This could take a while." Claire gritted her teeth. Time was not on their side. The jammer wouldn't last forever, and once the cameras came back online, their presence would be detected within seconds. They needed to move fast. "Keep going," she urged. "I'll keep watch." As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew almost unbearable. Ethan kept glancing at the phone, willing the progress bar to fill faster. Every tiny beep or whir from the machines made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though he knew the cameras were disabled for. Now suddenly, Claire stiffened. Her sharp intake of breath caught Ethan's attention, and he turned to look at her. "What is it?" he whispered urgently. "I heard something," she said, her voice barely audible. "Footsteps. outside. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Are they coming this way? I don't know, Claire admitted, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at her side. Stay calm. Finish the download. I'll handle it. Before Ethan could protest, she slipped out into the hallway, closing the door silently behind her. Alone in the server room, Ethan tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Claire got caught? What if the guards found him here, hunched over a computer with stolen data on his phone? He shook his head, forcing himself to concentrate. Panicking wouldn't help anyone. Meanwhile, Claire crept down the corridor, her senses on high alert. Sure enough, 2 guards were approaching, their boots echoing softly against the polished floor. They weren't in a hurry, they probably thought they were just doing another routine patrol. But Claire knew she couldn't risk them getting too close to the server room. Thinking quickly, she ducked into a nearby alcove and waited. As the guards passed by, she stepped out behind them, moving with precision and speed. Before they could react, she struck one swift blow to the neck of the first guard, followed by a well-placed kick to disarm the second. Both men collapsed to the ground, unconscious but alive. Claire dragged them into the alcove, hiding them from view. Then, without missing a beat, she returned to the server room. When she opened the door, Ethan looked up, relief washing over his face. Did you? They're dealt with, Claire interrupted, cutting him off. For now. How much longer? It's almost done, Ethan said, watching the progress bar inch closer to completion. Claire nodded, checking her watch. The jammer has 2 minutes left. We need to be out of here before then. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the phone buzzed, signaling that the download was complete. Ethan unplugged it quickly and shoved it into his pocket. Got it, he said, standing up. Good, let's go. They retraced their steps through the server room and climbed back into the ventilation shaft. Crawling through the narrow ducts felt even more claustrophobic now that they were racing against time. Every creak of the metal beneath them sounded deafening. And Ethan couldn't stop imagining guards bursting in at any moment. When they reached the exit point near the rear fence, Claire went first, dropping down quietly onto the grass. She scanned the area, ensuring the coast was clear before motioning for Ethan to follow. He landed beside her, wincing as his knees hit the ground. Now what? He asked, brushing dirt off his hands. We get out of here, Claire replied, already leading the way back toward the woods, fast. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees and damp earth. Behind them, the facility loomed like a sleeping beast, its floodlights casting long shadows across the grounds. As they reached the edge of the woods, Claire paused, glancing back one last time. They were clear, she said, exhaling deeply. For now. Ethan nodded, his legs trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. What happens next? Claire gave him a grim smile. Next, we analyze the data. Find out exactly what they're planning and how we can stop them. Back at Ethan's apartment, they spread the contents of the encrypted phone across his laptop. Files upon files appeared on the screen, filled with technical jargon and diagrams that neither of them fully understood. But one thing was clear: Project Nemesis was real. The documents detailed experiments involving neural implants, artificial intelligence, and something called cognitive reprogramming. It was designed to erase free will, replacing human consciousness with programmable directives. This is insane, Ethan murmured, scrolling through page after page of horrifying information. They're trying to control people's minds, and they're close to succeeding, Claire added, her expression dark. If we don't act fast, they'll roll this out on a massive scale. Millions of lives will be changed forever, or destroyed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? Leak this to the press? Go public? Claire shook her head. Not yet. We need proof, a smoking gun that ties everything back to the people funding this project. Otherwise, they'll deny it and bury us before we can blink. Then where do we start? Ethan asked. Claire tapped a file on the screen. Here, this document mentions a key figure overseeing the operation, someone named Dr. Alan Cross. If we can track him down, we might be able to expose the whole conspiracy. Ethan frowned. And how do we find him? That's the tricky part, Claire admitted. It's not listed anywhere publicly. But there's a Ledane address, tied to one of the companies involved. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Realize this means breaking into another secure location, right? Assuming we survive the first attempt. Claire smirked, though there was no humor in it. You signed up for this, remember? Couldn't argue with that. Despite the danger, despite the fear gnawing at his gut, Ethan knew he couldn't walk away now. Whatever was coming next, he would face it head-on. Together, they began, planning their next move, knowing full well that the stakes were higher than ever. Document, Part 5. Ethan stared at the laptop screen, his eyes scanning the documents they had retrieved from the server room. The more he read, the heavier the weight on his shoulders became. It wasn't just the scale of Project Nemesis that troubled him, it was the realization that this wasn't some far-off conspiracy dreamed up by a mad scientist in a basement. This was real. Powerful people were behind it, and they had resources, influence, and no qualms about using them to get what they wanted. Claire sat across from him, her expression unreadable as she flipped through printed copies of the files. She didn't seem surprised by the details. They only confirmed what she already knew. But Ethan could tell she was processing everything carefully. There was a tension in her movements, a quiet determination that made it clear she wasn't going to stop until this operation was dismantled. So Ethan said finally, breaking the silence, "What do we do now?" Claire set down the papers and leaned back in her chair. "We follow the trail," she replied simply. "This Dr. Alan Cross is our best lead. If we can find him, we can uncover who's really pulling the strings." Nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in his mind. "But how? You said yourself, he's not listed anywhere publicly. Even if we track down the address tied to the company, there's no guarantee he'll be there. That's why we need to be smart about this," Claire explained. "We can't just barge in like last time. We need to gather intel, first learn their routines, figure out where they're vulnerable, then we strike." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "And what if we fail? What if they catch us?" Claire's gaze hardened. "If they catch us, we fight. But we don't have the luxury of failure, Ethan. Too much is at stake." Her words sent a chill through him. He knew she was right, but that didn't make the reality any less terrifying. For weeks he'd been living on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when or if the other shoe would drop. Yet here he was, planning yet another risky mission with someone who seemed fearless in the face of danger. Later that evening, they decided to split up temporarily to cover more ground. Claire went to scope out the address linked to the company, while Ethan stayed behind to dig deeper into the files. Sitting alone in his apartment, he felt a strange mix of isolation and purpose. On one hand, he missed the normalcy of his old life, the predictable rhythm of work, friends and weekends spent doing nothing in particular. On the other hand, he couldn't deny the thrill of being part of something bigger than himself. For once, he wasn't just another cog in the machine. He was fighting back. As he sifted through the documents, one name kept appearing: Blackthorn Industries. It was a multinational corporation involved in everything from pharmaceuticals to advanced technology. At first glance, it seemed legitimate. Enough donations to charities, partnerships with universities, glowing press releases about innovation and progress. But beneath the polished surface lay a web of connections to Project Nemesis. Blackthorn wasn't just funding the project, it was its backbone. Ethan jotted down notes, trying to piece together the puzzle. Cross-referenced names, dates, and locations, searching for anything that might give them an advantage. By the time Claire returned, he had compiled a list of potential leads. "Anything useful?" he asked as she walked in, setting a bag of takeout on the table. "Maybe," she said, pulling out a map. "The building's heavily guarded, but I found a service entrance that looks promising. It's tucked away in an alley, so it's less likely to be monitored closely." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Less likely doesn't mean impossible." "True," Claire admitted, "but it's our best shot. Plus, I noticed something interesting while I was there." She pointed to a spot on the map. "There is a cafe across the street. It's got a perfect view of the entrance, if we stake it out. For a few days, we might be able to spot patterns in their security." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That could work, assuming they don't change things up randomly." "They won't," Claire said confidently. People are creatures of habit. Even guards who think they're unpredictable fall into routines. Eventually, over dinner, they hashed out the details of their plan. They would alternate shifts, watching the building, taking turns sleeping and resting. Once they had enough information, they'd decide on the best way to infiltrate it. It wasn't glamorous work, but both of them understood the importance of patience. The next morning, Ethan took the first shift at the cafe. He ordered a coffee and settled into a corner booth, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping one eye on the building across the street. From this angle, he could see the service entrance clearly, as well as the occasional guard patrolling the perimeter. Everything seemed calm, almost a calm. Hours passed without incident. Just as Ethan began to wonder if Claire had exaggerated, the level of activity, a black SUV pulled up to the service door. Two men stepped out, carrying briefcases. One of them glanced around nervously before knocking on the door. A moment later it opened. They slipped inside. Ethan grabbed his phone and snapped a quick photo of the license plate before jotting down the time and description of the vehicle. When Claire arrived to relieve him later that afternoon, he filled her in on what he'd observed. This could be big, she said, studying the photo. If those briefcases contain sensitive materials, we need to know what's inside. How do you suggest we find out? Ethan asked. Claire smirked. Leave that to me. That night, Claire put her plan into action. Disguised as a delivery driver, she approached the service entrance with a package in hand. The guard on duty barely glanced at her ID before waving her through. Inside, she navigated the narrow hallways, memorizing the layout and noting key areas of interest. When she reached the main office floor, she slipped the package under a desk and left unnoticed. Back at Ethan's apartment, she recounted her findings. It's a maze in there, she said, sketching a rough map. But I managed to plant a bug near the reception area. With any luck, it'll pick up conversations we can use. Ethan stared at the map, impressed despite himself. You really know how to handle yourself, huh? Claire shrugged modestly. Years of practice. For the next several days, they listened to recordings from the bug, piecing together fragments of information. They learned that Dr. Alan Cross visited the building twice a week, usually accompanied by a team of researchers. Meetings were held in a secure conference room on the top floor, accessible only via a private elevator. Security was tight, but not impenetrable. We'll need a distraction, Claire said after analyzing the data. Something big enough to draw attention away from the elevator. What did you have in mind? Ethan asked warily. A fire alarm, she replied. Simple, effective, and easy to trigger remotely. While everyone evacuates, we slip into the elevator and head upstairs. Ethan frowned. Won't they notice if the system goes offline during the evacuation? Not if we disable the cameras first, Claire countered. I've already mapped out their blind spots. Long as we move quickly, we should be fine. Though skeptical, Ethan agreed to go along with the plan. They spent the following day preparing, testing equipment, and rehearsing their roles. By the time night fell, they were ready. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the building. Claire carried a small device designed to trigger the fire alarm, while Ethan carried tools to disable the cameras. Working together, they executed their plan with precision. Within minutes, alarms blared and chaos erupted as employees poured out of the building. Taking advantage of the confusion, they slipped inside and made their way to the elevator. The ride to the top floor felt endless, each second stretching longer than the last. When the doors finally opened, they stepped into a sleek, modern conference room filled with screens and documents spread across the table. This is it, Claire whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Everything we need is right here. Worked quickly, photographing files and downloading data onto a portable drive. But as they were about to leave, a voice stopped them cold. Impressive, Dr. Alan Cross said, stepping out of the shadows. Though I must admit, I didn't expect amateurs to get this far. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. Beside him, Claire tensed, her hand reaching for her gun. You shouldn't have come here, Cross continued, his tone eerily calm. Now, you'll have to pay the price. Before either of them could react, armed guards burst into the room, surrounding them. Trapped and outnumbered, Ethan realized they had underestimated their enemy and now they were paying the price. Document Part 6. The room felt smaller with the guards closing in, their weapons pointed directly at Ethan and Claire. Dr. Alan Cross stood calmly in the center of it all, his hands clasped behind his back, as if he were overseeing a business meeting rather than a standoff. His demeanor was unsettling calm, almost amused. As though this was just another day at the office, Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way out. There wasn't one. The guards blocked every exit, their rifles steady and ready to fire. Claire, on the other hand, didn't flinch. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her gun, but she didn't raise it. She knew better than to make a move that would get them both killed. "You've been quite the thorn in our side," Cross said, his voice smooth and measured. "Breaking into secure facilities, stealing data. Did you really think you could stop something like this?" Claire met his gaze without hesitation. "We're not stopping until Project Nemesis is exposed," she replied, her tone sharp and defiant. "You can't control people like puppets. It won't work," Cross chuckled, softly shaking his head. "Oh, my dear, it already has. The technology is flawless. Resistance is futile. You'll see that soon enough." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, anything, to match Claire's boldness, but the words caught in his chest. Instead, he glanced at her, hoping for some kind of signal or plan. But Claire's focus was entirely on Cross. Her eyes locked onto him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Let me guess," Claire said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to try to convince us to join you, aren't you? Or maybe wipe our memories clean so we forget all about this little adventure." Cross smiled faintly, as if impressed by her insight. "Actually, I was considering something simpler. Elimination. You're too much of a liability now." One of the guards shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Cross. "Sir, are you sure about this?" "If word gets out, it won't," Cross interrupted sharply, silencing the guard with a single look. Then, turning back to Claire and Ethan, he added, "No loose ends. That's how we operate." Claire's jaw tightened. She glanced at Ethan briefly, her expression unreadable. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it hidden. For a moment, the room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife, and then, without warning, Claire acted in one fluid motion. She raised her gun not at Cross, but at the nearest security camera mounted on the wall. A deafening crack echoed through the room as the lens shattered into pieces. Before the guards could react, she fired again, disabling a second camera. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards shouted orders, scrambling to reposition themselves while trying to figure out what had just happened. "Now," Claire yelled, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him toward the far corner of the room. Ethan stumbled forward, his heart pounding as bullets whizzed past them. Claire pushed him behind a large conference table, using it as cover. She returned fire, forcing the guards to take cover as well. The sound of gunfire filled the air, drowning out everything else. "What do we do now?" Ethan shouted over the noise, his voice trembling. "We improvise," Claire snapped, reloading her weapon with practiced speed. "There's an emergency stairwell down the hall. If we can reach it, we might have a chance." Ethan nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't trained for situations like this. He was just an ordinary guy thrust into extraordinary circumstances. But survival instinct kicked in. Together, they made a break for the door, dodging bullets and diving. For cover whenever necessary, Cross watched from a safe distance, his expression unreadable. "Don't let them escape," he barked, gesturing for his men to pursue. The hallway outside was eerily quiet compared to the chaos inside the conference room. Claire led the way, her movements swift and deliberate. They reached the stairwell, in record time, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind them. Ethan leaned against the railing, gasping for breath as Claire quickly secured the door with a makeshift locka. Piece of wire she'd pulled from her pocket. "That won't hold them for long," she said, gripping her gun tightly. "Need to keep moving." They descended the stairs as fast as they could, skipping steps and taking corners at full speed. Every creak of the staircase echoed loudly in the confined space, making Ethan paranoid that someone was right behind them. By the time they reached The ground floor, his legs burned with exhaustion, but he forced himself to push through. When they burst through the exit door, the cool night air hit them like a wave. They were in a narrow alley, surrounded by towering buildings and dimly lit streetlights. Claire paused for a split second, scanning the area for threats, then motioned for Ethan to follow her. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice low but urgent. "We're not safe yet." Behind them, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. The guards had breached the stairwell and were giving chase. Claire and Ethan sprinted toward the main road, weaving between parked cars and trash bins. Their pursuers were gaining ground, shouting commands and firing warning shots into the air. Ethan's lungs felt like they were on fire, each breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled once, nearly falling, but Claire grabbed his arm and yanked him upright. "Keep going," she urged, her grip firm. Finally, they reached the edge of the alley and ducked into a crowded sidewalk. Pedestrians milled about, oblivious to the danger unfolding around them. Claire seized the opportunity to blend in, tugging Ethan along as they disappeared into the throng of people. They moved quickly, putting as much distance between themselves and their pursuers as possible. After several blocks, Claire spotted a taxi idling at the curb. Without hesitation, she flagged it down and shoved Ethan inside. "Drive," she commanded, sliding into the seat beside him. The driver, startled by her urgency, hesitated for a moment before stepping on the gas. As the car sped away, Ethan turned to look out the rear window. Two guards emerged from the crowd, scanning the street frantically, but they were too late. The taxi rounded a corner, leaving them behind. For the first time in what felt like hours, Ethan allowed himself to exhale. His body slumped against the seat, his muscles trembling with relief or maybe shock. He glanced at Claire, who sat rigidly beside him, her eyes still alert, scanning the streets for any sign of trouble. "We lost them," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting earlier. "For now," Claire corrected, her tone grim. "But they'll come after us again. Next time, they won't underestimate us." Ethan nodded, staring out the window at the blur of city lights. Despite their narrow escape, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. Cross hadn't been bluffing when he said they were liabilities. People like him didn't let threats walk away, they eliminated them. Back at Ethan's apartment, they barricaded themselves inside, double-checking locks and windows, to ensure no one could sneak in unnoticed. Claire immediately booted up Ethan's laptop, transferring the files they had stolen onto multiple encrypted drives. She worked methodically, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "What happens if they find us?" Ethan asked, pacing nervously across the room. "We can't keep running forever." "Won't have to," Claire replied, her focus unwavering. "Once we expose Project Nemesis, they'll lose their power. Then we'll turn the tables on them." "But how?" "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and smarter," Claire interrupted firmly. "That's our advantage. We know what they're planning. They don't know how far we're willing to go to stop them." Ethan stopped pacing, looking at her with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "You really believe we can pull this off, don't you?" Claire finally looked up from the computer, her blue eyes meeting his. "I have to," she said simply. "Because if we don't, no one else will." Her conviction was contagious. Despite the odds stacked against them, Ethan felt a spark of hope ignite within him. Maybe they couldn't win this fight alone, but they weren't entirely alone either. Somewhere out there, others must have seen glimpses of the truth, fragments of the conspiracy. If they could rally those people, unite them under a common cause, perhaps they stood a chance. "We need allies," Ethan said suddenly, voicing the thought forming in his mind. "People who can help us spread the word, gather evidence, fight back." Claire nodded slowly, considering the idea. "It's risky. Trusting others means risking exposure. But you're right, we can't do this alone." Over the next few hours, they brainstormed potential contacts: journalists, hackers, activists, anyone who might be willing to listen and lend a hand. Claire suggested reaching out to an old acquaintance of hers, a tech-savvy hacker named Mia, who specialized in uncovering corporate secrets. Ethan remembered mentioning her once during their early conversations, and Claire agreed she might be their best bet. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. The road ahead was fraught with danger, uncertainty, and sacrifice, but, for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it head-on.